The war was over, but the shock had only just begun. In the late summer of 1945, after Japan's surrender, thousands of weary prisoners of war were transported across the Pacific. They were gaunt, their uniforms threadbare, their faces carved by years of hunger and disease. For men who had survived on bowls of millet, scraps of rice, and sometimes even tree bark in the jungle campaigns, captivity in American hands was at least a reprieve from starvation. Yet what they were about to witness would leave them more stunned than any battle. A group of Japanese prisoners, guarded by Marines, were marched across the deck of a massive U.S. aircraft carrier. The scale alone was overwhelming. Planes were parked wing to wing, steel stretched further than the eye could see, and sailors bustled about with casual energy. But then something even stranger caught their attention. Along one side of the deck, a line of American sailors stretched out in an orderly queue. They were not waiting for weapons or rations. They were not preparing for combat drills. They were waiting for dessert. At the head of the line, smiling cooks in white aprons scooped ice cream into bowls, handed them across the counter, and ladled chocolate syrup or fruit on top. The Japanese prisoners stopped in their tracks. They stared in disbelief. Ice cream? On a warship? Some whispered nervously among themselves. One prisoner muttered, almost in awe, "Kori no shoki hinda." Ice food. His voice trembled, as if describing a miracle. Others simply stood silent, their hollow eyes fixed on the sailors spooning cold sweetness into their mouths. Back home in Japan, sugar had vanished from civilian life years before. Children grew up without ever tasting candy. Soldiers in the field ate what little they could find: millet, dried fish, grass boiled into soup. By the end, some units were reduced to eating leather belts or tree roots. And here, on the deck of an American carrier, men who had just won the greatest naval war in history were casually enjoying ice cream, as if it were as essential as bullets or bread. One POW, stunned, finally asked a guard through broken English, "So much, every day?" The Marine laughed, shrugged, and said, "Hell, we've even got ships just for ice cream." The words fell like thunder. Ships for ice cream? The prisoners exchanged disbelieving looks. In their world, every ounce of steel, every drop of fuel had gone to war production. In America's world, the industrial machine was so vast, so overflowing with power, that it could afford to build floating factories dedicated not to weapons, but to frozen dessert. For the Japanese prisoners, the realization was crushing. Their entire lives, they had been told America was weak, decadent, a nation of soft men who would crumble before Japan's spirit. Yet, standing on that deck, watching sailors laugh over bowls of ice cream while fleets of carriers, cruisers, and destroyers stretched to the horizon, they knew the truth. America had not only outgunned them, it had outsupplied them, outfed them, and even outindulged them. What did it mean that the United States could build ships just to make ice cream? What kind of nation wielded abundance itself as a weapon of war? The Japanese POWs would never forget that moment. For them, the taste of defeat was not only bitter, it was cold, sweet, and served in a bowl. The Second World War was not only a clash of armies and fleets, it was a contest of endurance, of industry, and of the simple ability to feed men in the field. Few contrasts between the warring nations were as stark as those between Imperial Japan and the United States. By the early 1940s, Japan was already a nation under strain. Its island geography left it dependent on imports for food and fuel. Once war cut off access to overseas shipping, shortages became severe. Rice, the staple of Japanese life, was rationed to the bone. Civilians substituted millet, barley, and even chestnut flour for daily meals. Sugar vanished from shelves. Meat and fish became rare luxuries, and by 1945, many families survived on watery gruel. For soldiers on distant Pacific islands, the reality was even harsher. Supply lines were thin, convoys decimated by American submarines. Accounts survive of Japanese troops boiling tree bark for soup or eating insects to survive. Hunger became as deadly as bullets. The United States lived a different reality. To be sure, Americans at home faced rationing of butter, gasoline and meat. But rationing in America was not about scarcity. It was about fairness. Behind it stood an industrial machine unmatched in human history. Farms across the Midwest produced grain, corn, and beef in record quantities. Canneries and factories turned out Spam, powdered milk, chocolate bars, and coffee by the ton. American soldiers overseas carried not only rifles and helmets, but Hershey bars, chewing gum, cigarettes, and powdered lemonade. One of the most unexpected luxuries to accompany American troops into battle was ice cream. From North Africa to the Pacific, ice cream was considered a vital morale booster. Commanders recognized that small comforts could make men fight longer, endure hardship better, and feel closer to home. Reports circulated of ice cream machines being installed in mess halls, or improvised on submarines using torpedo tubes filled with milk and ice. Soldiers spoke of it as a reminder of childhood, a taste of normal life amid chaos. To Japanese eyes, this was unthinkable. Propaganda at home had painted Americans as weak and self-indulgent, unable to withstand true hardship. They were described as decadent, softened by luxuries. But the irony was that America's luxuries did not weaken it, they strengthened it. The ability to provide not only food, but treats, for millions of men across half the globe, spoke of an industrial depth Japan could never match. By 1945, the contrast had reached almost absurd proportions. While Japanese civilians chewed on sweet potato vines and soldiers died of starvation in the Philippines, the U.S. Navy authorized the construction of floating ice cream barges, ships whose sole purpose was to produce frozen dessert for sailors and Marines fighting in the Pacific. Each could churn out hundreds of gallons a day, distributed to destroyers and carriers across the fleet. To American sailors, it was a welcome treat after months at sea. To Japanese prisoners of war, it was a revelation and a humiliation. The day Japanese POWs realized that America could build ships just to make ice cream was the day many understood the war had never been a fair contest. Guns and courage could not overcome factories and farms that could turn sugar and milk into luxuries at the edge of the world. What began as a simple dessert became a symbol of morale, of abundance, and of the overwhelming industrial might that made America's victory inevitable. For Japanese soldiers, the war was as much a battle against hunger as it was against the enemy. From the beginning, their rations were meager, designed to stretch thin supplies across distant fronts. A typical Japanese field ration consisted of rice, barley, or millet, sometimes flavored with dried fish or pickled vegetables. When rice became scarce, substitutions grew desperate. Sweet potatoes, grass, even boiled tree bark in extreme cases. By 1944, entire garrisons were collapsing, not from combat, but from starvation. One veteran later recalled bitterly, "We were told spirit would overcome hunger, but spirit cannot fill an empty stomach." The shortages reflected Japan's precarious position. The island nation imported most of its food before the war. Once American submarines began targeting Japanese shipping, those imports dwindled to nothing. On isolated Pacific islands like Saipan and Guadalcanal, units were cut off entirely. Men wasted away. Some resorted to catching rats or stripping bark from palm trees. By 1945, accounts of cannibalism surfaced, grim proof of desperation. Contrast this with the American experience. U.S. soldiers received standardized rations, canned meat, biscuits, chocolate bars, chewing gum, coffee, and cigarettes. These K rations might not have been gourmet, but they delivered calories, variety, and comfort. The Army even included small luxuries like fruit bars, lemon powder, or instant soup. To Americans, food was fuel, morale, and identity. One Marine remembered, "You could be half a world away, but you'd sit in a foxhole eating a Hershey bar, and for a moment, you were home." Even more remarkable was the way America treated food as a morale weapon. The U.S. military experimented with ways to deliver comfort foods wherever troops went. Coca-Cola bottling plants were built overseas, turning out millions of bottles a day for soldiers. Candy companies designed bars that wouldn't melt in the heat. And ice cream, once thought impossible to transport in war zones, was carried to the front in insulated containers or improvised freezers. To Japanese eyes, this abundance was unthinkable. Soldiers who surrendered and became prisoners of war often described their shock at the first American meal. Instead of watery rice, they were given bread, butter, meat, and fruit. Many grew sick from overeating, their starved bodies unprepared for such sudden richness. But nothing astonished them more than dessert. Accounts tell of Japanese POWs aboard American transports being offered ice cream for the first time. For men who had not tasted sugar in years, the frozen sweetness was almost beyond comprehension. Some refused at first, suspecting a trick. Others licked cautiously, their eyes widening as the cold, creamy flavor spread across their tongues. A few wept openly, overwhelmed by a taste that felt like another world. One prisoner later wrote, "We had believed Americans were soft, but we realized then they were strong enough to make even sweetness a weapon." The contrast between scarcity and abundance struck at the heart of morale. Japanese soldiers had been taught that privation was a virtue, that to endure hunger was proof of loyalty. American soldiers, by contrast, were told that comfort and morale were essential to fighting spirit. Both nations believed their philosophy gave them strength, but only one had the resources to sustain it. Even before news of ice cream barges spread, Japanese POWs were staggered by what they saw in American supply depots. Warehouses filled with sugar sacks, crates of canned peaches, barrels of chocolate. At one captured base in the Philippines, prisoners marveled at stockpiles of candy and chewing gum, luxuries denied to civilians back home since 1942. Some POWs described feeling a mix of envy and humiliation. How could Japan hope to defeat a nation that treated sugar as plentiful as sand? One officer admitted privately, "In Japan, sugar was a treasure. In America, they fed it to prisoners." The first taste of ice cream, therefore, was not just a culinary experience, it was a cultural shockwave. It forced prisoners to reconsider everything they had been told about the enemy. The United States was not decadent and weak. It was overflowing with strength so vast it could afford to turn luxury into routine. In Japan, sweetness had been rationed out of existence. In America, sweetness was turned into a weapon of morale. That revelation cut deeper than any bayonet. It planted the seed of realization that Japan's war could not be won. And yet, the most shocking display of abundance was still to come. when POWs discovered that America had not merely supplied ice cream to soldiers, but had gone so far as to build entire ships whose sole purpose was to make it by the ton. By 1945, the United States military was not only supplying its soldiers with the basics, it was supplying them with luxuries. And among those luxuries, one stood out as the most improbable of all: ice cream. The U.S. Navy, recognizing the morale-boosting power of small comforts, went beyond improvised treats and decided to industrialize dessert. In July of that year, the Navy commissioned the conversion of concrete barges into floating ice cream factories. Each barge cost roughly $1 million to build, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to building several destroyers. Yet commanders deemed it worthwhile, believing that the psychological lift provided by ice cream would strengthen sailors and Marines grinding through the brutal Pacific campaign. The specifications were staggering. Each barge could produce 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. Over a day's operation, that meant more than 500 gallons, enough to serve tens of thousands of men. The barges had refrigeration units, mixing machines, and storage freezers, all powered by diesel generators. They could anchor near fleets, churning out dessert that was then ferried by smaller vessels to aircraft carriers, battleships, and destroyers scattered across the Pacific. For American sailors, the ice cream barges were a dream. After weeks at sea, eating canned meat and powdered eggs, a dish of cold, sweet ice cream was more than a treat. It was a reminder of home. One Marine later wrote, "We could go through hell in the jungle, but when they brought us ice cream, it felt like heaven for 5 minutes." The psychological effect was deliberate. U.S. commanders understood that morale was as important as ammunition. A soldier who felt remembered, who felt cared for, could endure longer, fight harder, and recover quicker. In this sense, ice cream was as much a weapon of war as bullets and bombs. Now imagine the perspective of Japanese prisoners who encountered this floating luxury. For men who had not tasted sugar in years, who had fought to exhaustion and watched comrades die of starvation, the sight of ships devoted to making dessert was incomprehensible. It was not just abundance, it was abundance turned casual, abundance treated as routine. One Japanese POW later recounted the moment. "We heard the Americans had ships for ice cream. At first, we thought it was a lie. No nation would waste such resources. Then we saw it with our own eyes. And we knew we could never have won." The shock went deeper than food. It was a cultural earthquake. Japan had built its war effort on sacrifice and scarcity, preaching that deprivation was proof of virtue. America built its war effort on plenty, promising soldiers they would not only fight but live well while doing so. For POWs, this contrast was devastating. It suggested that America's softness was actually an overwhelming strength. The Japanese Navy, by comparison, was starving. By 1944, fuel shortages kept ships trapped in port. Sailors were issued rations of rice so small that many supplemented their diets by fishing over the side of their vessels or boiling seawater for soup. Malnutrition spread, morale collapsed. Against this backdrop, the idea of ships dedicated to ice cream was beyond imagination. American newspapers even boasted about it, portraying the barges as symbols of industrial confidence. One headline read, "Navy builds barge to keep sailors and ice cream." To civilians, back home, it was amusing. To Japanese POWs, it was crushing proof of disparity. Beyond the barges, ice cream became a fixture across the U.S. military. Carriers had their own freezers. Submarines improvised by mixing powdered milk and sugar in torpedo tubes. Field kitchens experimented with making frozen desserts whenever supplies allowed. Soldiers joked that America's secret weapon wasn't the atomic bomb, it was ice cream. POWs absorbed these stories with a mix of disbelief and despair. In camp interrogations, some admitted that hearing of ice cream ships shattered their faith in Japan's ability to resist. How could we fight men who built ships not for guns, but for ice cream? One prisoner asked his interrogator. The symbolism was profound. A destroyer or a battleship represented hard power, something Japan could at least understand. But an ice cream barge represented something else entirely. A nation so rich, so confident, that it could project comfort into war zones. That was psychological warfare at its most subtle and devastating. And yet, the shock was not only felt by prisoners. Civilians in post-war Japan would soon learn the same lesson. When occupation forces introduced ice cream to Japanese cities, it became a symbol of modernity, of abundance, of a new way of life. What had once been unthinkable, frozen dessert in a nation racked by hunger, became commonplace. The cultural shift that began on POW decks would ripple into Japan's future. But in 1945, for those weary prisoners, the revelation was raw and immediate. The United States had ships just to make ice cream. And in that simple fact lay the unbridgeable gulf between victory and defeat. The news spread quickly through prisoner of war camps. Some men had seen the barges with their own eyes, others heard it whispered from fellow captives who had crossed the Pacific. The details varied. Some claimed the ships produced thousands of gallons a day. Others said they had seen sailors eating ice cream on deck as if it were their birthright. But the core fact remained. The United States had vessels dedicated not to warfare, but to dessert. For Japanese prisoners, the effect was profound. Many had already felt the sting of defeat as they encountered America's endless convoys of supply ships. the sight of entire horizons filled with Liberty ships carrying food, fuel, and ammunition. But the ice cream ship symbolized something different. It was not just about logistics or firepower. It was about a culture of abundance that made Japan's sacrifices seem meaningless. Letters from captured soldiers, later reviewed by Allied intelligence, revealed their astonishment. One wrote, "We starved while fighting, yet the Americans ate like kings. They built factories on the sea to make sweets. No nation can stand against such power." Another confessed, "I thought Americans were weak, but if they can live this way in war, then they are strong beyond measure." The psychological blow was immense. For men raised in the ethos of Bushido, the way of the warrior, victory was supposed to come from discipline, sacrifice, and willpower. They had been told that America's soft living would collapse under the strain of war. Instead, they saw that America's softness was its strength. Soldiers who could eat well, sleep well, and enjoy luxuries like cigarettes and ice cream fought longer and harder than starving men driven only by slogans. This realization chipped away at the mythology of Japan's invincibility. It also cracked the Nazi-inspired propaganda that had painted the United States as a divided, decadent country. The ice cream ships stood as floating monuments to the opposite: unity, confidence, and an industrial capacity so vast it could afford frivolity. The consequences did not end with surrender. After the war, many former POWs carried these memories home. When asked what had most surprised them about America, some answered not with tanks or planes, but with food. The fact that the enemy could deliver luxuries in the middle of battlefields convinced them that Japan had been doomed long before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In occupied Japan, civilians would encounter ice cream soon enough. U.S. forces, eager to win hearts and minds, introduced it alongside Coca-Cola, chocolate, and chewing gum. For children who had grown up in a world of scarcity, the taste of ice cream was unforgettable. It became associated with America itself, a symbol of a modern, prosperous lifestyle that contrasted sharply with the grim austerity of wartime Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, leading the occupation, recognized the power of such cultural symbols. Allowing Americans to share ice cream and candy with Japanese civilians softened resentment and made the presence of foreign troops less threatening. By the late 1940s, Japanese entrepreneurs were opening ice cream parlors in Tokyo and Osaka, inspired directly by American influence. For former soldiers, the symbolism cut even deeper. They had fought believing that starvation was noble. Now they lived in a world where their children licked ice cream cones, laughing in the streets. The lesson was humbling. Sacrifice and deprivation had not brought victory. Abundance had. One POW later confessed in an interview, "We thought we could overcome hunger with willpower." But the Americans proved that feeding a soldier was stronger than starving him. His words echoed the broader shift in Japanese society toward embracing consumer goods, comfort, and modernity as the building blocks of national strength. From a strategic perspective, the ice cream ships also demonstrated how total war was fought differently by America. Where Japan devoted every resource to weapons, America devoted resources to sustaining its people, soldiers and civilians alike. The result was not only victory, but a legacy of cultural influence that persisted long after the fighting ended. The broader impact extended into the Cold War. Just as swing music and Hollywood movies became cultural weapons against the Soviet Union, so too did food. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, and candy bars all became part of what historians later called soft power, tools that persuaded and attracted rather than coerced. The seeds of that strategy were already present in 1945, when Japanese POWs realized they were up against something far larger than guns. And so the memory lingered. Men who had once fought to the death recalled the surreal moment of seeing Americans casually eat ice cream while fleets stretched across the Pacific. For them, it was not simply a taste of defeat. It was the sound, sight, and sweetness of when the day was hot and heavy, the kind of day when steel decks shimmered beneath the Pacific sun. A group of Japanese prisoners, recently captured and weary from weeks of hunger, were being escorted across the broad deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier. Their uniforms hung loose on their skeletal frames, and their eyes darted nervously at the forest of airplanes lined up wing to wing. The immensity of the ship itself already felt unreal, but what they saw next struck them with even greater force. Near the center of the deck, a long line of American sailors stretched patiently toward a serving station. The prisoners assumed it must be for ammunition or rations. But as they drew closer, they saw white-coated cooks moving quickly behind a counter. Bowls clinked, spoons scraped, and laughter carried on the wind. The Americans weren't preparing for war. They were waiting for ice cream sundaes. One by one, sailors received heaping bowls of frozen dessert, topped with syrup, fruit, or sprinkles. They grinned, joked with each other, and ate with the easy joy of men far from home but never far from comfort. The Japanese prisoners slowed their march, transfixed. Some blinked in disbelief, others muttered under their breath. One prisoner whispered to his comrade, "They fight, and yet they eat like this?" Another shook his head, stunned. "They even have ships for ice cream." The realization rippled silently through the group. Their own navy had sent men to sea with dwindling rice rations, sometimes forcing them to drink seawater or fish over the side. Their own soldiers had perished on islands, starving in caves, reduced to eating roots and insects. And here, on the deck of a warship larger than any they had ever imagined, the victors were served dessert in abundance. The emotional blow was overwhelming. The prisoners had been taught that America was decadent, weak, incapable of enduring hardship. Yet, in this moment, they saw that abundance was not weakness, but strength. America's power was not only in its battleships and carriers, it was in its ability to make life comfortable for its men, even at war's edge. One officer, gaunt and hollow-eyed, broke the silence at last. Speaking in a low voice, he confessed, "We thought our guns made us strong, but this is stronger. We had already lost." The words cut deeper than any bayonet. The men around him lowered their eyes, some nodding reluctantly, others swallowing hard as if to hide shame. They knew it was true. For the guards escorting them, the moment required no explanation. They didn't boast, they didn't lecture. The ice cream itself was the message. It spoke louder than propaganda, louder than speeches. It was proof that America's way of war was built on a foundation Japan could never match, an endless supply chain, an economy so vast that luxury could be treated as routine, and a belief that caring for morale was as important as firing a gun. The Japanese prisoners carried that memory with them for the rest of their lives. It was not the roar of bombs, nor the thunder of artillery, but the quiet clink of spoons against bowls that marked the true measure of their defeat. The day they saw Americans casually eating ice cream on a ship designed for battle, they understood that the war had never been equal. And that moment, sweet, cold, and surreal, became one of the most unforgettable symbols of America's triumph. Empire that had mastered the art of war through abundance. When historians speak of the Pacific War, they often focus on the great battles, Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. They describe the thunder of guns, the clash of fleets, the devastating bombings that shattered Japan's cities. But for many Japanese prisoners, one of the most enduring memories was far quieter. The moment they realized America built ships just to make ice cream. It was not a detail lost in the chaos of war. It became a story told and retold among prisoners, then later among civilians. For men who had endured hunger and seen comrades waste away from starvation, the revelation was staggering. Ice cream, something long vanished from Japanese life, was not only present in America's war effort, it was mass-produced at sea. The lesson was inescapable. Japan had built its war machine on sacrifice and deprivation, convincing its people that willpower could overcome material shortages. America had built its war machine on abundance, ensuring its soldiers were not only armed but fed, comforted, and even indulged. The contrast was not simply logistical, it was philosophical. One nation preached endurance through suffering. The other preached strength through plenty. In the end, abundance proved the stronger creed. The psychological impact of this revelation rippled far beyond the war. For Japanese POWs, the memory of ice cream ships became shorthand for the vast gulf in power between their nation and the United States. Some admitted later that they realized, in that moment, victory had never been possible. America's ability to fight while living well, to treat luxuries as routine, was a weapon Japan could never counter. In the years that followed, ice cream became a part of Japan's new cultural landscape. During the American occupation, U.S. forces introduced it to civilians. Japanese children who had grown up knowing only scarcity suddenly tasted sweetness on their tongues. For many, it was a symbol of a new era, of prosperity, of change, of a world no longer dominated by sacrifice. The symbolism was powerful. A simple dessert had become an emblem of America's victory, not just militarily, but culturally. Ice cream, like Coca-Cola and jazz, was part of the soft power that reshaped the post-war world. It was proof that sometimes wars are won not only with steel and fire, but with comfort, morale, and the promise of a better life. One former prisoner summed it up decades later. "We lost because they could make ice cream in war and we could not." His words carried more weight than they first appear. They spoke of industry, of supply chains, of national priorities. They spoke of a truth as simple as it was devastating. Abundance is power. And so, when we look back on the war, it is worth remembering that victory was not only measured in battles won or ships sunk. It was measured in the small things. Cigarettes handed out on the front lines, candy bars and ration packs, and yes, ice cream served on the decks of carriers. Those small comforts spoke louder than speeches, louder than propaganda. They told the world that America could fight harder because it could also live better. Wars are fought with steel, but remembered with sweetness. For Japanese POWs, the taste of defeat was not only bitter, it was cold, creamy, and unforgettable. And this was only the beginning. For in the years ahead, America's food, music, and culture would not just stun prisoners of war, but transform entire nations, winning battles of the spirit long after the shooting stopped.